None of the teachers have been in here except that one.
I mean, Travis, do I need to do anything with these mics up here?
No, we should be good with it. I just brought them in just in case we needed them.
Okay. Okay.
So just use your teacher voice.
Okay. Guys, just have a seat right along there. For you. I cannot find your
Right there.
It's just there. I didn't just attach it.
Actually shortened it.
Absolutely. Correct? Yes.
After the
Yes, definitely.
All right, I want to welcome everyone to the, I've got a feedback, I'll have to get used to that. To the November panel discussion. We're going to be talking about why I'm thankful for free market capitalism and why you should be too. Before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and do some introductions of our panelists, who I'm very pleased to have with us today. We'll start off closest to me, Professor Craig Dawkins. Came to Rose State College in January of 2005 after a long career in the private sector. Craig served as the CEO of CDI Incorporated from 1997 through 2002 and went to work as a financial advisor for Morgan Stanley in 2003. From 1984 through 1997, he held various private sector positions as a buyer, regional sales manager, and general manager for nationally known retailers, Dillard Department Stores, Montgomery Ward, and Barnes & Noble. Craig is in Texas, Florida, Alabama, Missouri, and Oklahoma, and he currently teaches personal finance, intro to investments, principles of microeconomics, and macroeconomics here at Rose State College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Craig Dawkins. Next to Professor Dawkins, we have Professor Kristen Wolfe. Professor Wolfe holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of Arkansas and a Master of Business Administration degree from the University of North Florida. She spent her first 5 years after graduation as a research economist for Sheldrick, McGehee, and Kohler? It's Kohler. Kohler, all right, the largest business valuation firm in the Southeast United States. Upon completion of her graduate studies, she began a full-time teaching position with St. John's River State College in Orange Park, Florida, where she was promoted to the rank of professor. She began her position with Rose State College during the fall semester of 2010. She has published research on economic development in China, as well as the effect of technological advances on the economic growth rates of developing economies. Please welcome Professor Wolfe. And at the far end of our panel is Dr. James Hochtritt. Dr. Hochtritt has a BA in American Studies and a BA in History from California State University, and also a Master of Arts and a PhD in American History from the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Hochtritt teaches African American, American Indian, and U.S. history at Rose State College. He is a cultural and social historian by training, and his research is focused on the issues of ethnicity and race in the 20th century American West. Again, please welcome Dr. James. I am excited to have these three panelists with us in this discussion today. probably a little bit intimidated as well, given the body of knowledge that they bring to this discussion. I'm going to start off by way of explaining how this topic came to be, why I think it's important, and then my thoughts on it, and then we will have plenty of time for each of our panelists to explain to you why I don't know what I'm talking about, or something along those lines. But obviously it's November. We're thankful. We're thinking about things that we are thankful for. You get past the big things, family, obviously. For me, a work environment that has been a wonderful experience. I have great colleagues who let me drag them into activities such as this when they might rather be doing something else. So I'm thankful for that. Thankful for health. We're all thankful to be healthy. So you get past those big things, and I started thinking, well, what else am I thankful for? And I said, you know what I'm really thankful for? I'm thankful for an environment, an economic environment where things like this get made, where I can stay in touch with anyone in the world with this one little device. I'm thankful for technology that allows us to communicate and share this panel with people miles away. They don't have to be here in this room. I'm thankful for an economic system that provides me a great variety of options in everything from clothing to shoes to cars and everything else. But more important than that, all right, those are nice benefits, but more important than that, I'm thankful to live in an economic environment in which the standard of living over the past 200 years has increased dramatically from what it was. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So I'm thankful for the innovation that we see. I'm thankful for the opportunities. It truly is today. I mean, if you live in today, in 2015, there are more opportunities for you as an individual to be successful and to define that success for yourself than there has ever been in the history of humanity. And so I am thankful for that opportunity to live at this point in time. And I'm thankful for what I believe is one of the driving causes of that environment, which is the notion of capitalism. Now, I've been talking about capitalism for a long time, and I've been talking about it a lot the last few months. One of the things that I have discovered is that we talk about it a lot, but a lot of people have no idea what it really is. They have no understanding of how this economic system works. And unfortunately, a lot of times the largest critics of it are the ones who know the least about it. And so I'm going to, first of all, define capitalism for you. And then I'm going to kind of undefine it. I'm going to take some of the misperceptions that I have seen from people both who say they support this notion of capitalism and those who oppose it. And I'm going to take those off the table a little bit. And then I'm going to describe very briefly why capitalism works the way it works, and then I'm going to hand it over to our panelists to share their thoughts as well. Capitalism as an economic system is built squarely on the notion of private property, your ability as an individual to own things and to do with those things what you believe is in your best interest. Now, let me define that for a second, because there's a lot of modern day discussion of capitalism as being built on greed or being built around selfishness, this notion of selfishness. Adam Smith, who is the father of modern capitalism, if you will, was a moral philosopher. Before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, and where he outlined this grand scheme of capitalism, he wrote the theory of moral sentiments, in which he was trying to evaluate what made people do things in a moral and ethical way. And so he would not agree that capitalism is about greed. In fact, I believe Adam Smith didn't disregard that completely. It is about self-interest. Well, what is self-interest? Well, you are enrolled in college because you see it to your best interest to be here, right? Of all the options that you could be, does that make you a selfish, greedy person? No, it does not. If you have a family, you work hard to take care of that family, to provide them the best that you can. Does that make you a selfish, greedy person? No, it does not. And so when we hear the term interest or self-interest, we need to separate that from this notion of selfishness or greed, because they are completely distinct and separate things. Going back just a little bit for philosophy, and those of you who've been in my classes are familiar with this, John Locke argued that we inherently have the right to property. We have that right as individual humans. And Locke, if you remember, defined property very broadly, right? It's not just these tangible physical things that we can see and feel and touch, but it is also our thoughts, our labor, our rights, if you will. All of those things that go into making us indeed a truly functioning human being in the world around us. Adam Smith developed upon this notion of property and discovered that the ability of individuals to develop, to improve, and to exchange property was a driving force in the creation of wealth for society at large, as well as for individuals who are engaged in those activities. So capitalism at its base, its very definition, relies upon private property. This is important. Oftentimes you will hear people describe countries, especially countries perhaps in Western Europe that have high taxation rates or a great deal of government benefits, and they'll describe them as socialist countries. They are not socialist. They are not socialist. Why? Because they still have a private property basis of functioning. Now, they may tax higher, and we can talk about that. And there is such a thing as de facto socialism, but nobody's dealing with that kind of arrangement right now. You either have it or you don't. But it is this idea that we all can take things, make them, improve upon them, whether that's ourselves or something tangible that we own, and then exchange it for something that we find of more value. That leads us to the second principle of capitalism, which is the idea of voluntary exchange. Right? You cannot have a free market if you do not allow people to exchange goods and services, and to do so with the least interference possible. Right? The idea is that we all value things differently, and it is by coming together and to interacting with one another that we find what we value here, what someone else values there. We make exchanges when they are in our mutual best interest. Right? That leads us to the third principle of capitalism that I'll mention, which is the idea of the absence of coercion or fraud. All right? Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you there is no fraud in business activity today. That is not what I am saying. What I am saying is fraud is anti-capitalism. And this goes back to something that Smith discovered, was that if you want to have long-term relationships with people, mutually beneficial relationships with people, you cannot defraud them and continue that relationship. If I sell you a bottle of water and it tastes like battery acid, all right, but I tell you it's the best thing in the world, okay, and it's dirty and it's got stuff in it, right, you might buy it once without seeing it, and then you probably won't come back to me, all right? That is the root of capitalism, the freedom of you as the consumer in some instances to choose your alternatives and to make choices based on what you believe is going to benefit you, your family, whoever that you are concerned about. But the absence of being able to defraud people. The other one is coercion, right? We do not force you to engage in transactions. That too is anti-capitalism, all right? The idea that some third party is going to make a decision on your behalf, not knowing your particular circumstances or the other person in the exchange's circumstances, all right? Or preventing, in some cases, transactions from happening, and we might have some discussion on that as well. All right, now that I've kind of laid out kind of the theoretical groundwork for what capitalism is, let me undefine it for you. Let me reverse some things that you have probably heard in the popular media and elsewhere. Number one, capitalism is not pro-business. Again, I'm going to come back to Adam Smith, who said, anytime you get a collection of business interests together, what's the first thing they will do? They will try to distort the market into their favor. All right. And Dr. Jeffrey Myron from Harvard School of Economics said that what happens is capitalism requires businesses to compete with one another. They would rather not compete with one another. And they certainly would rather have it more difficult for new competitors to engage in the market. Some modern day examples of this would be how taxi cab services are reacting to Uber is an excellent one. What do we do with the competition between online sellers and brick and mortar sellers and the relationship with sales taxes and such there? So there's no shortage of examples where established business interests try to restrict the ability of new competitors to enter their markets. That is anti-capitalism. It may be pro-business. Ford, GM, Chrysler, they don't want a bunch of imports of foreign automobiles into the United States. Why? Because it forces them to compete with other companies. But what it does for you, the consumer, is it gives you more options, and it gives you the lowest price for the best possible good that you can achieve. A second redefinition, if you will, is that capitalism is anti-government. We hear this all the time. Why do we need the government doing this? Why is the government doing that? All right. Again, capitalism cannot survive without a government that does a few basic things really, really well. And I'm going to emphasize two of those things. Number one, you need a system, a government that can identify and enforce clear, distinguishable property rights. If you have private property, you have to be able to identify who owns the property. This is one of the most crucial elements to keeping developing countries from moving forward, their economies moving forward, is that people who would be interested in investing and building an enterprise in a particular country cannot be guaranteed that if they buy the land and build the building and invest in all of this, that 2 or 3 years later, somebody's not going to come back and say, that person didn't own it. They had no right to sell that to you. We are taking this property back from you. So the ability to have clearly identified property rights is crucial. And from my perspective, I don't know of any other entity that can do that other than government. A second basic requirement that we need government to do is to enforce contracts. We are all familiar with the idea of contracts. We sign them all the time. I sign them when I buy my home, when I buy my car, when I buy something else. And that contract is a guarantee, right? It means that you and I agree that you are going to do one thing and I am going to do another thing. And if one of us fails in our obligation that we have made to the other, there is a legal remedy to solve that problem. Again, the justice system remains the purview of, if you will, the government, and only the government can enforce those contracts as they are agreed upon. A third redefinition that I'm going to offer is the notion that capitalism causes poverty. Dr. Deidre McCloskey, fastly becoming one of my favorite economists, has a nice explanation of a brief economic history of the world. And the short of it is, up until 1800, from the time of recorded time till 1800, virtually everybody was poor. There was no economic growth to speak of. There was certainly competition between nations for gold and silver, but the idea of economic growth was non-existent. And then around 1800, you begin to see economic growth happen at a rapid pace across the world. Dr. McCloskey's explanation for this is it was the innovation and the social honor that merchants and traders received as a result of this growing capitalist movement. And so rather than causing poverty, capitalism has been the most effective system for eliminating poverty the world over. A phrase that probably people don't know was in Adam Smith's work, The Wealth of Nations. He talked about universal opulence, the idea that if you allow people to exchange, if you set up a system that provides these basic necessities for a market to work, that what you will see is a rapidly increasing living standard for all people. We see that today. The World Bank issued a report a couple of weeks ago saying by the end of 2015, you will have lifted 150,000 people a day out of extreme poverty across the world. In the United States, we talk of poverty, but the reality is most of our citizens will never know, will never experience the notion of extreme poverty, and that is a good thing. That does not mean there are not people who are in need. It does not mean that there are things that we should do to assist those people who are in need. But it means the system that is moving standards of living increasingly higher is the system of capitalism, and we need to recognize that. That does lead me to this notion that capitalism is opposed to helping the poor. Nothing could be further of the truth, and I want to refer back to Adam Smith again. Adam Smith wrote that as the wealth of a society grew, the beneficence, the benevolence of that society would increase as well. And he was fully aware that as the wealth of society grew, the increase in resources to the government would grow as well. Even if you kept taxes at the same rate, because you had more wealth moving through society, the government would have more resources. I'm going to refer to three very well-known free market advocates: Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Charles Murray. All proposed some form of basic guaranteed income provided through the government. All right, so capitalism is not opposed to helping those who need assistance. But what capitalism brings to the table, what it requires us to do, is to evaluate the trade-offs of various means of providing that assistance. What happens to work incentives? What happens to efficiency? And how do we make sure that those who need the resources get those resources? Capitalism brings us to the answer, requires us to answer those questions. Very quickly, why does capitalism work? Number one, the price system. Prices communicate information more quickly than any other means that we have. They tell us what people value and to what extent they value it. They tell us when there is a shortage of a particular good or service. They tell us when there's a shortage of a particular resource. Markets require producers to continuously improve. This is why the innovation happens, because markets allow you to think of a better way of doing something that someone else is doing. You do it faster, you do it more effectively, you do it in a completely different way. Next, markets use and develop. The use and development of private property improves the value of that property. We know this inherently. If you own something, you tend to take more care of it than if it's some sort of communal property. You mow your lawn regularly, unless you're at my house, and then maybe not so regularly. Right? But you take care of your property. But we often see communal property that is left adrift and not developed. Finally, markets help direct self-interest to socially beneficial endeavors, and they create positive social behaviors. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. There are limits to markets, but I want to give our panelists each a good amount of time to visit with you as well, and then we will open it up to questions. So, Professor Dawkins, we'll start with yourself.
Okay, so I've got a lot of thoughts going through my mind right now. First of all, great job. I thought you did a great job in laying that out. When I think about Milton Friedman, I think about markets, I think about some comments that he once made, and he said, just because markets aren't necessarily a perfect solution, it doesn't mean that a government solution would be any better. That if there's market failures, there's also government failures, and as such, it could be that the good is markets, but not the perfect, and to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So when I think about things like this discussion about free markets, capitalism. Capitalism is simply put the private ownership of the means of production. And people that work in that kind of economy get to decide what they want to do in life. So then what's the alternative to that? What's the alternative to a system where private individuals get to decide what it is they want to do, and there's a different form? Well, in a socialist or a socialized system, the state owns the capital. So all of the things that you don't like about capitalism are then molded into a single entity where it's no basis of you don't earn your way there through some type of production, but often by who you know. What politician you know that will open up a factory in your part of the realm. So it's not about what you've earned, the kind of performance that you've had, but more in the sense of who you know. It monopolizes all of the terrible things that we really don't like about what we refer to as crony capitalism, where things are gained in such a way as to reward the few at the expense of the many. So when you think about socialism in the United States, we do have some models of this. And if you think about our public school system, here we have a public school system where the government decides what schools you attend based on where you live. They decide essentially what teachers you're going to have. Your ability to actually move to a different school is dependent on your ability to actually leave your property and relocate somewhere else. Let's think about if we did shopping that way. Would you only like to shop at malls that are in your direct area, or would you like the flexibility of going to a shopping store of some kind that's outside of your district? Would you like someone telling you, the kinds of cars that you could buy based on where you live? So I think the argument is also one of freedom. If private individuals don't get to decide what businesses to start and what careers they wish to pursue, then who is deciding this? So you're all students here. So instead of us asking you what your major should be, we will just have you complete a test, and we will tell you what your major is going to be on the basis of the outcome of your test.
And no shaking heads out of the audience. That's great. No.
So it speaks to freedom. Now, Milton Friedman said that capitalism is a necessary condition for freedom. He didn't say that all free places that have, or all places that have capitalism are free, but he's saying that all places that are going to be free necessarily require capitalism as one condition, because that means that private individuals get to decide, not a central authority getting to decide what businesses to run, what to produce, how much, what the people are going to do by assignment. So with that, I'll kind of leave some time.
Okay, that's cool. Do you want to go next? So we do like economist, historian. I don't know how that works. Okay. Well, what I wanted to expand on is you mentioned the dollar price rationing mechanism, basically, which is how we distribute goods and services in a capitalist system. Basically comes down to prices. But there's a little bit I want to add on there because it kind of comes back around as well. We distribute things based on prices. And you guys know when you go to the store, you look at the tag and you decide, you make a choice. Do I want to purchase this? Is it worth it to me? Do I value it for the amount that they're currently charging? Or is it not worth it to me and maybe I'll put that back on the shelf? You guys have made decisions like that, right? Okay, so it works the other way as well. Dollar price rationing is one mechanism by what we choose the goods and services that we want, but it's also the situation and the income that we receive is essentially how, if it makes any sense, we also choose the other end. So how much income you have influences what you can buy, right? And that encourages you to make the best use of your property. So it kind of ties in the idea of self-interest. But one of the things I like to mention is one of the reasons, not the only reason probably, but one of the reasons you guys have chosen the major that you have and that you're going to college in the first place is that when you finish up, the expectation is that you're going to earn what? More money than you can earn right now. Otherwise, college wouldn't be a beneficial trade-off, right? You wouldn't be acting in your own self-interest if you weren't going to earn more money after you finished this grueling, come on, grueling process that is college, yes? Okay, so if you get through with all of that, you succeed through the gauntlet, the income that you earn is basically how employers value your resources. So your human capital, right? Your brain, your skill set, your life achievements, all of those things are kind of wrapped up into you. So you're looking at both ends. The income I earn determines what I can buy, just like the prices of those things determine what I can buy. So income is really that measure of the value that your skill set puts you in society, and prices are that determination of what the goods and services are valued at. So for example, while we're all up here doing okay in terms of salary, Kevin Durant, his skill set, right, is valued a little more highly than ours. I quite frankly don't understand why. Come on, that's hysterical. No? All right, good. Because again, there's a scarcity of resources, right? There's all these kinds of things. And you guys know that it takes a vastly different skill set to play professional basketball at that level than it does to sit here and talk to you guys about stuff you find boring and we find fascinating. So as a result of that, though, you kind of have to look at both of those things. So markets, in my opinion, do the best job of sorting out mechanisms or measurements of value. Not only what goods and services are worth, but in a weird way, what we're all worth to the market as well. The cool thing about that is that you can make your own choices in this system to determine, again, how much do I want to be worth on a market value perspective. I'm not saying your worth as a person, your kindness, your any of that. I'm talking about the resources you possess, right? That human capital, those things you take to the marketplace. And the difference between that and in a system where they require you to choose a major is they put you to the use that the government or the society feels where you'd be most valuable. But in a way, income really is doing that as well. If you want to earn a higher wage, then you be an engineering major, right? It's kind of the way it works. You end up with one of those more complicated majors where you know the salary will be higher. But for many of us, it's not worth that. I want to do work that I enjoy. So the income is one decision-making factor, but it's not the entire thing. The coolest thing, again, about capitalism within this structure is that it lets you choose. So self-interest is one of those things I like to discuss where we're making the best decisions for ourselves with the resources we have at our disposal. And everybody has slightly different, right, abilities and resources. And so we put those to their highest use, or essentially the use that will get me as much as I can in terms of what I want. And that's really what capitalism boils down to me. And the idea of self-interest, what Adam Smith was trying to say, is really just the freedom, right? The ability to make your own choices and make the best situation for you and your life that's possible. And I think that's the problem with limiting. So when I heard the topic of this discussion, it was why I'm thankful for capitalism. The biggest thing for me is choices, the ability to choose what I do, where I go, what I buy, the people with whom I transact. There's no forced transactions, all of the things that we've talked about today. And that's really what it comes down to, me being able to live the life the way I want to, within certain parameters, obviously, but making those decisions for myself. And I hope you guys do too.
I don't disagree with my esteemed colleagues have said, and I would be a fool to disagree with Adam Smith's theories laid out in his 1776 publication of Wealth of Nations. I will take issue, however, with the concept of self-interests. You know, organizations, institutions, systems, in this case, free market capitalism, they're only as good as the people who are involved in them. And when you speak of self-interests, obviously we all have a vested interest, a self-interest in making as much money as possible, in finding the best opportunities for us.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the historical record of that, self-interest is oftentimes lacking any kind of an ethical or moral component. So let us go back in time, where we have an odious institution of American slavery that lasted 224 years, people who had no choice about how they could market themselves. They were under lash, they were under the command of people who ran the tobacco plantations, the cotton plantations, the sugarcane plantations, the indigo plantations. And these slave owners were simply, if we abide by this notion of capitalism as being driven by self-interest, they were simply acting in their own self-interests. But the people that they were enslaving, which amounted to about 4.5 million people on the verge of the Civil War, they had no voice in that dynamic at all. And then you get to the period after slavery, when indeed people were set free in 1865. Most Black Americans, African Americans were living in the Deep South at that point. But you very quickly see a repercussion, a backlash in the part of those who controlled the economic means of production in the Deep South. You see laws passed that limited what Black men and women, what kind of jobs they had access to. They really were not operating in a system of equality of opportunity. They were not operating in a system of economic equality of opportunity, social equality of opportunity, educational equality of opportunity, which, as all of you know who are in college, in theory at least, the more education you acquire, the more ability you'll have to market yourself and to turn money. So that's just one dynamic of self-interest, and this was going to go on for a long time. I mean, we're talking 100 years or so after slavery ended, and one could even argue to this very day there are inherent inequalities of opportunity in this country based upon a person's perhaps gender in some cases, their ethnic background, their racial background, and so on. You then look at American workers prior to their unionization. Now, unions inherently, if you know anything about the history of unions in the 20th century, full of corruption, full of misappropriation of funds, organized crime was heavily involved. But at the same time, prior to the ability of workers to unionize, they were working horrifically long hours in incredibly dangerous conditions. They had no benefits whatsoever, simply because it was not in the best interests of the people who had the means of production, who controlled the large corporations and factories. It's not in their best interest to minimize profits at the expense of trying to provide their workers with somewhat comfortable lives. The same could be said for child labor. We didn't have uniform child labor laws in this country in most states till 1914. I don't know if you were aware. I mean, you had little 10, 11, 12-year-old girls working 10, 11, 12 hours a day in sweatshops. You had little boys, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, going down in West Virginia and Pennsylvania coal mines, working as if they were able-bodied, physically mature men. It was not in the best interests of those mining operations, the factories, to cut in their profits. You can call it self-interest, but ultimately it's all about the bottom line. You look at American Indians in this country, pieces of legislation like the Dawes Allotment Act that dismantled the reservations in the United States in an effort to turn American Indians into individual productive workers, farmers, and so on, which runs contrary and counter to the American Indian ethos of communalism. Self-interest is not looked upon to this very day among very traditional Indians as something that is noble. To look out for yourself and to not be aware of other people in your community, a term that you might be familiar is the moral economy. So capitalism does not necessarily abide by their long traditions and their perspectives on economics. You look at corporations before, as my panelists mentioned, you have to have some degree of government regulation and so on. But prior to the advent of those kinds of laws, it was not in the best interest of a timber company to gain access to 500,000 acres of forest lands for the production of lumber, for the production of goods, to provide people jobs. It was not in their best interests to worry about how they're going to replace that timber that they're utilizing until you see government regulations come into play. State where I come from, California, to this very day, it's been a long, historical, dirty little secret that the majority of people who work on those large farms, as well as smaller farms in California, about half of those individuals, predominantly Mexican, are here illegally. It is not in the best interests of Del Monte or Libby or Sun-Made Raisins or the almond companies or the grape companies. It's not in their best interests to have laws passed or to have people come in, looking for those illegal immigrants. It's just sort of, shh, don't ask, don't tell. It's been going on forever. And I don't want to belabor the point. I mean, I could talk about multinational corporations like United Fruit Company going into Latin American countries rather, and exploiting workers down there and taking lands and turning people into poorly paid wage laborers. But I think you get my drift. I love the system. I wouldn't want to live in any other system. It's an incredibly beautiful system, and I think history has shown that communism and systems such as that are fallible. People don't want to live like that, but let's not paint capitalism in too rosy of pictures. It inherently comes with problems, usually because of the people who are participating.
So to say, anytime you've got humans involved, there's going to be
There's going to be error, and it'll never end.
Absolutely.
Never end.
I want to thank each of our panelists, and I think Dr. Hochtritt, your remarks remind me of something that sometimes regulation can actually make the market work better. And
I would always agree with that.
and so
Yes,
and there's a wide room of latitude to talk about which ones and how and what but I do think that's worth noting, that capitalism can coexist with a government that tries to ensure some of these basic issues are taken care of. And if you think the United States, just alone as a country, is relatively young as a nation. And so we had to learn through trial and error what works and what doesn't work. And we're still trying to learn much through trial and error what works and what doesn't work. And so I want to open this up now. If we have any questions from any of our attendees, if you'd like to ask a question of one of our panelists, or maybe someone who's watching via the live stream. Anyone? Okay, I'm gonna start off. I'm gonna just throw an issue out here. There are a variety of them we could discuss, but this is one that I think is both relevant and in some ways timely. Organ transplants. We have a system right now that ensures that people will die, is basically what the system does. And it ensures that more people will die than is necessary because we're afraid to establish a market, any type of market. And therefore, we both keep some people in poverty, and we ensure that other people who need organs will not have access to those organs. I'm throwing that out for you guys.
Can I just say, where we don't establish a market establishes itself.
Oftentimes.
Yes, even though, again, it's going to be a black market, it's going to be an underground market, there will still be a market for all of these things that we say you can't market because there's an immorality to marketing that thing. So I think to say that there is no market for organs in this country at this point in time is incorrect.
There's just not a recognized.
There's not a recognized or legal market. Yeah, there's a market,
Right.
absolutely.
So you're left with, no, seriously, the guy, it's good. This kidney is a really good one. I got it yesterday. Yeah, and I think the argument is that there's two sides of this. The one side of this is that if you're willing to donate a kidney to someone, that you should be compensated, and that we could have a market that says if you are willing to sell your kidney to somebody who needs it, that you would be paid a certain amount of money to do so. And that would make sure that there's an adequate supply of good quality kidneys for those people that need a kidney transplant. The argument, and then I don't feel free to chime in, but the argument against that, of course, would be that you won't have rich people lining up to sell their kidneys.
Right.
That it would be poor people that would say, hey, we could pay off the mortgage if each of us sell a kidney. And And so the financial pressures that might come to bear would necessitate that people that are not as wealthy would be the ones that would be somewhat victimized by the market.
I don't have any comments. On Oregon, no, I don't.
So if
We have a question.
Well, no, I kind of agree with what you're saying, because it's been kind of a proven fact that in Indonesia, the black market is vast, and a lot of people who are living way below the poverty line, they are entering into these black markets and getting paid for their organs, but it's bringing their families where they're able to establish, a future generations, sending their children to colleges, and in order to buy land just to maintain themselves. And I think a lot of people here in the US, they do travel, but if they had that entity here in the US, there would be a lot more of testing, and you're not getting bad organs, and you're actually making it lucrative for both sides.
Let me ask my panelists this. What are we've talked about, and I'm sure all of our attendees have heard the term black market. What are the negative consequences of black markets?
Well, a lack of quality control.
Okay.
And so you look at historically, something that comes to mind would be heroin. You don't know what you're getting if you're into heroin. But there has been historically in the United States certainly a huge market for heroin. But the person on the street purchasing a gram of heroin from someone, they have no idea. There's no quality control, there's no regulation, there's no dosage amount, which leads to people getting killed and so on. You look at something, another thing that might come to mind would be when the government outlawed the manufacture and distribution of alcohol, beginning in 1920, legislation passed a year earlier. One of the unintended consequences of that was that Americans, they did indeed begin drinking slightly less, but stepping into that vacuum was organized crime, which ultimately gave them a firm toehold in the United States. They controlled the alcohol industry and all the associated things connected to that until ultimately the government repealed that legislation in 1933. So again, you don't know the quality of alcohol. People are killing each other for regulation or control of that, control of that industry. So that would be another example of black markets requiring you have an open market, and then you're less crime. I mean, I think the drug issue in the country is a prime example of that.
You're going right in the next direction I was going.
Yeah,
to
Professor Dawkins
discuss.
will agree.
Yes.
Oh, we have a web question.
Question from the online watchers. Aren't poor people always at a disadvantage economically when they engage in transactions with the wealthy?
Well, that's an interesting question, because my answer to that would go to the University of Missouri football team, who recently decided that because of racist incidents that had happened on campus and they were dissatisfied with the wealthy overlords that ran the college, they were in a position to deprive the college of millions of dollars in revenue by refusing to play. So there's an example where those that are not being paid any money at all are in control of the outcome. And by the way, this is a private market response to a problem that is created often by issues of monopoly or monopsony, which monopsony is the idea that there's only one buyer of something as opposed to one seller of something. So I know I would not agree that they're always at a disadvantage. I think it would depend on the market. It would depend on the particulars, but they're not always at a disadvantage.
Well, I'd say that's exactly what you were describing with the rise of the unions, the AFL-CIO and the other unions, to defeat all of those poor working conditions. Basically, that's what happened. The little people banded together, created their own source of power, and fought back against the over control. So there are mechanisms and historical examples of that.
But at the same time, to kind of address the caller's question, I think I think my panelists would agree that economic power oftentimes translates into political power.
Absolutely.
And I don't think there's a disconnect whatsoever. And so in that case, yes, indeed, that the people who are more economically powerful do have an advantage over those who are less economically powerful in all kinds of different ways that we don't have time to go into that here. So yes, there is an issue there, but like, both panelists say, certainly we have opportunities to correct those things, whether it's in a smaller case like the University of Missouri or labor, because that was a big problem before unions. You can correct those things, most definitely. There are mechanisms, but
one more thing real quick is that, Charles, I think the question said when they engage in transactions too. Okay, so part of that springs to mind to me is it's not so much an economics issue as one group having more money than the other, and so therefore they have more control. It's a knowledge issue. Typically, the people with more money will have more information about the transaction that's occurring. And so we always think of usually the poorer person as the little guy, but it's not necessarily that they don't have power or finances, is that they don't have the knowledge to engage. And that's the thing, if you're voluntarily engaging in trade, the important part there is that it's all transparent, that everybody knows what everybody else is doing, that I know how Libby makes my fruit. For a consumer, it's important that I know that, but they're going to keep that information from me. So it's knowledge, I think, that really distorts that capitalist incentive. I can vote with my feet if I know how those things are produced. And there are more and more, especially in food production, there are more and more businesses, Whole Foods is a good example, where they basically try to explain to you where your food's coming from, with some obvious issues, but yeah, they're trying. It seems to me they're trying.
Going back to your comment about transactions, Ashley has a comment. Those kids are on scholarship. The school could just give their scholarships to someone else. They are kind of paid to play.
Well, if paying to play means that I get to go to school, I get room and board, and they feed me, and my rich overlords make millions of dollars, I would think that exchange is not equitable, to say the very least. And the truth is, they aren't being paid. Some of these guys have lifelong injuries as a result of their money making, of their venture essentially for the college. The other thing is that when you think about the fact that some of these guys have family members die in the middle of the season, and the college can't give them a plane ticket. They can't give them money to somehow navigate. You've also got people that are selling products, goods and services outside of the college with their number and their name on it, and they're not allowed to profit from it. That is the worst exchange in the world if that's the case. If that's being paid, they're getting screwed.
And I would add to that comment, they can't just go out and give those scholarships to someone. Again, we're talking about people who have a specific skill set that is hard to come by.
Absolutely.
If they could just give those away to other people, there would be much less money being made in that.
Earn as great a scholarship academically as we would for athletics.
Exactly.
That would be good too. But,
exactly.
yeah,
I also want to address the initial question of poor people being at a disadvantage in a transaction. If you remember, if the transaction is voluntary and the poorer person perceives themselves as benefiting from that transaction, then it's hard to make the case that they are somehow harmed by that transaction.
But I think
Now, that does seem sometimes people make bad decisions, right? Who bought that car that they shouldn't have bought that one time, right? We've all been there. And some of that is a lack of knowledge. Some of that is a lack of our own due diligence on our own part of researching it. But if you look at these transactions as free, uncoerced, absent fraud, and I think we have to go back. That's one place I think the government can help markets, is ensuring that fraud is not occurring. If you absent those, because one side benefits more than another side, does not mean that it is an unfair or improper exchange.
Well, and I think this kind of navigates its way into the idea that it's the government's position to always have competition be in place and not to be protecting industries from competition, which gets us into issues you mentioned, immigration. We have free trade from an economist perspective. It's not a controversial idea that trade is good. It is good for the most amount of people. Yes, there are some people who are harmed by trade because they were beaten by a better company that's located someplace else, for whatever reason, by the way. But we also have free trade of labor, which is the idea that labor can just go where it needs to go, where it's demanded. And that means that if they need workers in California, that those people should be able to just come across and compete. And if there aren't American workers willing to take those jobs for whatever reason, then they should be allowed to come over and do those jobs as a matter of free trade of labor. Why? They benefit. We benefit. Del Monte or whoever may be a beneficiary of that policy. And yet we do throw up barriers to protect against free trade. And it creates this kind of crony capitalistic problem where consumers are actually paying higher prices and getting worse services than they would otherwise get without free trade.
It also means too that the workers that are here illegally that you referenced are at a disadvantage. Whereas if they were able to freely come, they could make complaints and they could argue against. They could, whereas right now their rights are basically.
They have no
Exactly. If they don't have any power because almost of the governmental regulations that have been put in place that kind of treat them because they are non-citizens, treat them as non-entities, illegals, all of those, and put all those disparaging labels on them and prevent them from leveraging any form of economic power. So yeah, I think that's definitely
Okay. Do we have another question? No?
Oh, okay.
Anyone else? Back in the back.
I just want to understand, have your opinion about the intervention of the government to rescue Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae.
Okay.
Excellent question. The Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the housing crisis.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you.
Okay.
You'll be the best one.
So many people don't know that the role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is to essentially buy mortgages. There are many originators that are in the economy, and they originate these loans. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac comes along and they say, hey, this meets some criteria that we think is good, so we're going to go ahead and buy these from you. And then what Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae does is they have investors who they sell off these loans to in what we call tranches, and they invest in these tranches based on, well, these are really good mortgage payers, and these are kind of okay, and these are acceptable. And so that's kind of how it works. Now, it began, the whole idea of the United States is heavily engaged in the state, essentially, government mortgages, essentially. There isn't so much of a private system as there is a public one. And back in the Great Depression, it was hard for people to get loans on houses because the prices of everything were going down. So as a lender, you'd be faced with making a loan on something that would probably be worth less money in a few years. So as you can imagine, banks didn't want to do that. So these entities were created. And I would argue that you could throw not just Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but you could throw Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers and any number of other financial institutions, AIG, into this thing as to, well, why did it happen? Why did these companies end up having financial problems? And my opinion is, and there is some disagreement about this among economists, but my opinion is that whenever the laws were changed and that made the Community Reinvestment Act kind of enforce new lending underwriting standards, it essentially caused banks and every lending institution to lower their standards. And they sought to offload that risk by doing things called credit default swaps. And the whole thing was a stack of cards that was getting ready to fall down. So should they have bailed them out? The cost of not bailing them out probably would have been higher than the cost to bail them out. That's true. So on simply a cost benefit analysis, yes, I think they should have bailed them out, and they did. The question is, should Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac exist today? Should we have a publicly organized mortgage system where they buy all these mortgages and sell them off? That, I think, is another question. My inclination is to think no, that we don't. But there would be some that say, yeah, but what if we have another problem like we did during the Great Depression, and so that institution helped then, so it can continue to help. I think we have a modern financial system today that is better able to deal with that personally.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes.
in a lot of impoverished countries, they establish lending groups. Why do you think that lending groups haven't caught on into the U.S.? You know, with the economical downfall, you would think that that would help in order to make big purchases among certain,
So you're
minority
referring to
groups.
places where people put in just a little bit of money and then one person is able to use that money to
Exactly.
make a purchase or make a larger. Yeah, I think that the basic difference is, and this may be incorrect of me, and this may be my stupid thing that I say, but in my opinion, it's that in the U.S., it requires so much more capital to do some of the things that we want to do because of the prices that are higher. And we have, in a lot of these nations that you're discussing, they don't have a formalized banking system. You can't go to the bank and get a loan. You can't get a credit card. You can't access credit almost any other way. So these are very popular. And I think in the US, at least, we're more comfortable with dealing with financial institutions directly. It's kind of the history of our dealing with these credit systems. And so because we've got that formalized market, we don't need informal markets. I don't see necessarily why, other than it just kind of seems to be the way that we're comfortable with lending and borrowing. We don't trust each other as much as we trust banks, which is odd. We probably shouldn't. Personal opinion.
Well, banks are the most regulated industry in the United States and probably the world.
But if you look at a lot of minority groups, they've never had banking accounts. They've never applied for credit cards, and they trust within their village.
Their community, yeah.
And
yeah.
that's it.
And there may be more of those informal lending groups going on. I know there are studies about it, but I think data on that is obviously difficult to acquire. So that may be part of it, is just we don't know because it is so informal, the systems that are occurring.
All right. I want to thank again our panelists, Dr. Hochtritt, Professor Wolfe, and Professor Dawkins. Thanks to Travis Hurst for all the technical assistance on his end. Thank you all for coming. Our last panel will be in December, the last before finals week, right? And it will be on the topic of how to acquire a good education in the 21st century. So I hope you will join us for a very interesting discussion of what it means to have a good education. Thank you again.